Welcome to Well, Why Not? Conversations about opening your mind, then your passport. My name is Deborah and I'm a first-generation Haitian American who decided to leave the U.S. several times during my adult life. Currently, I live in Quito, Ecuador, where I've been for the past 4 years. I'd like to share more about my journey with you and invite others who have taken the leap to move away from the familiar, mainly in the form of immigration or expatriation. Greetings. Welcome to those of you who are tuning in for the first time, and welcome back to those of you who have listened to previous episodes. So today's episode is really, the title says it all. We aren't meant to do this alone. This has been a phrase that has been just repeating in my mind a lot over the past few months. And it started with a conversation that I had with a fellow expat, not somebody living in Ecuador, but somebody who's also living abroad and raising her children abroad. And we were talking about how being abroad, we set up these support systems. And sometimes these support systems can kind of serve as a crutch and keep us from learning as much as we need to, doing as much as we need to in the host country, just because we know that we have somewhat of a team ready and able to help us navigate some things. But even in speaking about that, what I realized was we really aren't meant to do life alone as humans, and whether you're an expat, you're an immigrant, you're, growing up in the same town your whole life, we aren't meant to do this alone. And I think at least for me, once I became an expat, once I left the US, I started to see how that expectation is something that is very specific to the US, to the American culture. And not to say it's good or bad, but in my case, I prefer the community. I prefer having a support system. I prefer knowing that I'm not alone in everything that I'm doing. And I think, as for the US and that being a value, it's just, in general, it's a very individualistic society where somebody doing all things on their own and juggling several jobs or doing literally like jobs of 3 or 4 people, that's considered amazing, and that's celebrated. It's looked at as a big achievement if you're able to get far, quote unquote. And success looks differently for everybody, but in general, it has to do with your career achievements and what you're able to acquire and being financially comfortable, financially stable. If you're able to do that all while juggling the jobs of literally 3 people, even more, even better. You're looked at as almost like a hero, and if that's all it's understandable, because it is amazing for someone to be able to do that. But it's not fair, and I don't think it's a fair expectation to place on people at all. If somebody chooses to do that, then great. But I just go back to, I think if you know that you don't have to, there's something that comes with that too. And knowing that you don't have to doesn't mean you're weaker or, you're not as strong and capable as someone else. It's just, that's equally as valuable, depending on your community, working with your community, having relationships that are reciprocal, of course. It doesn't, saying that you can rely on your community also means that your community can rely on you. I think that that's also a beautiful thing. So again, I just start with the basics, that I don't think that humans were actually meant just genetically to do things on our own. I think if you look historically, if you look at animals, other mammals, we gravitate towards others. We don't, we're not alone throughout our whole lives. There's I think at every point, at every juncture, at every phase in life, you're needing the support and the help of others. It just, again, looks differently depending on where you are in life. I always think back to some of the traditions in the Haitian culture. Some of it has changed over time. Some of it is because of American influence. I'm always amazed at how much American culture permeates into everywhere in the world, and now I think with the internet and social media even more. So there's a lot of the American culture that is glorified abroad, and other societies adapt some of those things. But I don't even want to say back in the day, because I don't think this has completely disappeared in Haitian culture. But I know that when it was more of an agrarian society, we had a practice called conbite, and that was when a farmer was getting ready to till or to harvest his land, and all of his neighbors, and when I say all of his neighbors, I mean like the mom, the farmer, the farmer's wife, the farmer's children, the cousins, the uncles, everybody came and helped work on the land. And then in return, that farmer would do it for another neighbor, and that was just how it got done, because farming wasn't industrial, and it was a big part of people's lives, everyday lives. So that's how they made it possible. If not for the help of other neighbors and coming together as a community for each plot of land, then somebody would not be able to harvest in a year, or somebody's land wouldn't be prepared to plant seeds. So I really, that was one tradition. I've never seen it. I've heard a lot of stories about it, and I just think that it is a really great example of what it looks like for a community to work together. Something else that was very, very common that isn't so much now is when somebody passes away. So when somebody on a street or in a neighborhood had a death in the family, like the whole neighborhood would come in and sort of take over that home until after the burial. And when I mean take over, like cooking, cleaning, there is another aspect before, I would say before mass migration, people did not spend a lot of time in the morgue. And I see it a lot in Latin America still, but over time, it's become, somebody passes today and sometimes it takes up to a month for them to get buried. But before then, it was pretty much you die today, you get buried the next day. And so in that case, when I talk about like the neighborhood taking over the home, it's not like they were doing it for weeks at a time. It was a very 2 to 3 day thing. But during those 2 to 3 days, you had a whole lot of support, and that I did see. I've had the opportunity as a child to see that happen, and again, it's a very beautiful thing when you think about it. It's chaotic looking. It seems like, wow, they just really come in and take over everything, and it's loud, it's rambunctious, but I think it says a lot about how we support each other in times of need, and helping people through the grieving process, because for us it's a big part of life. Like the way we grieve when somebody passes, it's almost like a lifelong thing. You have different steps of it, and there's you wear certain color clothes for a year, up to 5 years. I've heard some people do when it's a parent. So people know that you are still grieving, and I think that also attracts support without even having to ask for it. But those are like my two favorite examples in Haitian culture of how community is so important to your everyday life. Even I think once we do immigrate, there were things that I know I dealt with or grew up with that seemed odd to my American friends, but were just perfectly normal for us in our own culture. When my grandmother would come and stay with us growing up, my grandma would come and stay months at a time. She lived in Haiti, but would stay 6 months, 7 months, and then go back. And during those times, like, we would be in the same room. So it was almost that sense of my own room, my own space, yeah, that didn't exist for me, and I know for a lot of other Haitian Americans. It's family space. Your home is where your family lives, and that means sharing your room with siblings, with cousins, with aunts, with uncles. I mean, it's just perfectly normal. So I have memories of being on the phone and telling my friends like, oh, I got to keep it down. My grandma's sleeping, and they're like, your grandma's in your room, and I'm like, yeah, it's kind of her room right now too, because this is where she sleeps every night. So those, I think, and then just in general, having like a multi-generational home, having different, not just the nuclear family, it's, your extended family, lives with you, and that's perfectly normal. Having cousins that are more like siblings, all of that. I think also lends to this idea of you're not meant to be alone. You're not meant to do it alone. Because what that also means, I think sometimes people focus on what you lose, like you lose some privacy, you lose the ability to, really have your own space. But, you gain as a family. You're always surrounded, like in terms of childcare, let's say. I never went to daycare because of that, because we always lived with extended family. So there was always an adult around to keep an eye on me. And that also meant sometimes my mom didn't have to cook every night because somebody else took that on, or cleaning and all of it. I mean, it's really, there are a lot of advantages. There are a lot of benefits. I just had a thought. I remember years ago reading about postpartum depression in the U.S. and how it was less prevalent amongst Latino women, and they didn't really know why, but they did kind of link it to the fact that a lot of Latin cultures are very community oriented. So, and when I talk about community, I'm not just talking about like your neighbor. I mean, it really is having your cousins, your aunts, you have a lot of family around all the time. And they thought that having that support system. So as soon as a woman gave birth, she wasn't going home to an empty home, or she wasn't going home to just her partner, who also had to work and who wasn't around a lot. She had people there to help her, to take the baby and let her sleep some, or to prepare food for her. And the idea of this study was that was linked to lower cases, or a lower prevalence of postpartum depression. And I believe it. I mean, I had the same experience. I was very fortunate after having my kids too, to have my mom first and foremost, and also just a good support system that like I never felt alone. You are surrounded in our culture for the most part after having a baby, which is again a very beautiful thing, and how I think it's supposed to be. I don't think it's actually healthy to try and achieve everything alone. I think you will stretch yourself to an extent that's not healthy, whether it's physically, for your mental health. It's just not meant to be that way. You're meant to ask for help when needed. You're meant to get that help when needed. We're not set up to do 3 or 4 jobs. And when I talk about 3 or 4 jobs, it's not specific to like labor and getting a paying job. I mean how we expect women to be moms, to be the cooks, to clean the home, and to work, and to care for. I mean, it's just like one on top of it. These are all jobs. And in other societies, in other cultures, they literally are like you pay someone to do those things for you. And I really, when I was thinking about this whole theory and how, again, we aren't meant to do it alone, I realized for the longest, and not for the longest, up until this day, when I speak to Americans, and somebody will say like, oh, who's your kid with? Like if I'm traveling or something, oh, who's your son with right now? And I will say something like, he's with my person. For the most part, I'll say my person, and then they'll be like, what? I'm like, oh yeah, I have a person that helps me. I use such a convoluted way of explaining that I have a nanny, because in the U.S., the idea of having a nanny, it's loaded. It's loaded. It's not as simple as it is outside of the US, where of course you do, because you can't do everything. In the US, it's, oh, you must have a lot of money. Oh, what privilege you have. I mean, I've experienced the gamut, because pretty much right after I left the US in 2009, I hired somebody to clean the house. It started with that. Like, okay, I don't have to do it. I really like, and there are people who want to do this job, and it's not looked at, and that's another piece of it. It's not looked at as a lower status in society. Now, granted, of course, if you're in the service sector, as in the US, if you're working in the service sector, there are things that you probably won't be able to afford to do, and that's normal. You know, whether you're in construction, whether you're a plumber, all those types of professions, I think come with some sort of sacrifice. But it's not in the sense that, like, oh, this person is just doing this while they are working towards something else. There are people who spend their lives cleaning other people's homes as their profession, and they're really good at it. I mean, really good at it, and that's okay. And they, support their family, put their children to school. They do it. They do all the things that anyone else would do. But I think in the U.S. there is a lot more. There's just a negative perception when you talk about that. When you talk about having a housekeeper, when you talk about having a live-in nanny, or a gardener, things like that. It's very much tied to somebody who is financially well off, and in a lot of places outside of the U.S., middle class families have that kind of support, and just realizing that about myself and thinking, why do I do that? I really should be more frank, and then if somebody has a misperception about it, it's not on me, it's on them to clarify and kind of, I guess, understand, if they so choose, why I have a nanny. But even that is again a very American thing. Like, it's just not questioned in the countries that I've lived. You cannot, you're not supposed to. My grandmother had 7 children and never worked, or worked outside the home, was a stay-at-home mom. And my grandfather worked, and he was a public servant. So yeah, not at all like in the well-off category. But she, growing up, my mom and my uncles will say, like, she always had a housekeeper who would come and clean and cook, and she would, sort of lead that. But the reason they would talk about it is during the summer, she would send the housekeeper away because she wanted the kids to do those things. She wanted them to learn how to manage their homes and clean and cook and all of that. And for the most part, I have 5 uncles. Most of them do know how to do those things. I mean, when they immigrated, that was not a huge shock to them to have to clean up their homes or have to cook. And I've seen cultures where that's not the case. But all this to say, it is just very common outside the U.S., and it's not at all tied to social class. It's more, again, the acknowledgement that one person can't do everything. I also, not long ago, was talking about eating meals as a family, which is one of my, I guess, my values, and something that I've really strived to maintain for us since we've been abroad. When we moved abroad, I have to say, like, even when I was living in the U.S., I still did it. Even when the kids were little, we always sat at the table to eat. Even if it was after me cooking for 4 hours, but it was still something that I always prioritized. And in talking about this, a friend of mine was mentioning that this is something that they missed, and they didn't even realize they missed it until they were an adult, because then they realized realized the limitations of the contact that they had as a family, or the communication they had as a family, because it was everybody gets their meal and goes off into their own corners. And I also, in recognizing again that this is a priority for me, I also said, well, I mean, can I really, I not to say that I was bragging about it, but I said at the same time, I am very aware that the reason it's so easy for me to keep it as a priority is because I don't do the cooking. I cook once in a while when I want to. I do like to cook. It's not that something I'm adverse to. It's just I don't have to do it because I have other things that I need to be doing. And if I had to also cook, that would probably mean that, one, either we were eating a lot of fast meals, very simple meals, just because of time, or we would be ordering a lot because I cannot do it all. And that luxury, which that's the thing, I don't even think it should be, is what has also permitted me to keep those values. And I'm so grateful for that. Because I don't know if I would have been able to keep it going long term, had I been the one doing everything, doing the laundry, doing the, and then, some of this also is tied to expectations on women, but I'm not going to say it's just that. I know that even for men, or even if it goes beyond household duties, it's a lot. It's a lot that is expected on one person, because we're expected to be that independent. So I don't want to pass the judgment. That's what I've been trying to keep from doing, even as I think about this more and more. So I am always curious, like, are there people out there that do prefer an individualistic society? And I also know that I'm sure there are smaller communities, even in the US, who have more of that community-centered approach or culture. This is not meant to be a generalization for the whole country, but I'm always intrigued. Are there actually people who think that it's fair, it's great, that's how it's supposed to be, the more that you can get done on your own, the better, versus me, who thinks, no, the more that you can support each other, the more that we can support each other, the better we are in so many ways, not just for our physical and mental health, but I think it also encourages community cohesion. Like you get along better with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family, not just because you're dependent on each other, but because through that you also communicate more. You also can understand each other more, even through differences. I think there's more opportunity for you to gain a better understanding of each other, of different personality types, of what it means to work together for a common goal. So those are all the benefits I see. But again, I'm curious, what do you prefer? Do you think that it makes sense for people to strive for complete independence? If so, let me know with some comments or a voice message. Until the next time, thank you for listening. Be well.